This is No Nonsense Leadership, where we explore better ways to develop software products and services. Join world-class experts for honest insights and practical advice to help you lead digital teams clearly and confidently. Subscribe now to learn the best ideas in the field.
In this episode, we talk to Charles Lambdin about creating meaningful change in organisations. We examine the hidden conflicts that prevent organisations from adopting modern ways of working and uncover how incentives, power and stories influence company dynamics. Charles highlights the importance of understanding organisation politics and building a coalition to drive real change. Welcome to the No Nonsense Leadership Podcast. I'm Murray Robinson.
And I'm Donna Spencer.
I'm Charles Lambdin.
Hi, Charles. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
We would like to talk to you about why organisations are having so much trouble transforming to modern ways of working, which for me includes product thinking, design thinking, Agile, OKRs, Mission Command, all of these things that we talk about a lot on our podcast. But why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, so my name's Charles Lambdin. I have a PhD in human factors engineering. So I focused on user experience for a long time, and that led to me focusing on product strategy and then working on coaching teams, trying to integrate Agile and user experience, helping with Agile transformations. I was a senior consultant for a while, and that's still what I do. I've actually shifted more to quality now, but my background is in user experience. And then with the PhD, I mostly focused on cognitive psychology, judgment and decision-making.
Yeah, good. What's wrong with organizations today, Charles?
So when you talk about why Agile transformations don't tend to work, or why UX experts can't get the traction that they want to get, or why some of the best product thinking or things like Mission Command doesn't take in large organizations, it's because politically there's a conflict of interest and you end up butting up against an impasse where your goal doesn't really mesh with what the organization wants. And so how that ends up getting hashed out is going to be more in the organization's interest than yours. Gerald Weinberg called that Prescott's pickle principle. And what he meant was that your idea or your movement, you could call it Agile, you could call it user experience, is the cucumber. Well, the cucumber gets brined more than the brine gets cucumbered. It's going to get absorbed into the larger organization, and the larger organization will be more unchanged than your effort will be.
Okay, but when you say it's a conflict of interest, all of these modern ways of working that we're talking about are all designed to make organizations as a whole more successful. They're all about developing better products and services for customers and users more quickly and more effectively. And by doing that, the organization should produce more revenue, more profit, so it should be healthier. But then within the organization, the staff and management and everybody should be working together in a happier, more productive way with better flow of work. So how is that a conflict of interest to the organization?
It's a conflict of interest where you're advocating for increased autonomy for teams to actually be able to discover and iterate in a real sense of the term versus those who get ahead or are successful by having their top-down plans implemented. And what they view as success is not the same thing as what a successful Agile or UX team is advocating for.
I think you're talking about management and particular senior management's interests.
Right, sure.
Those interests could be quite different to the interests of the shareholders or the customers or users. So I feel like while we might argue that these modern ways of working are good for the organization and the shareholders and the staff, I think what you're saying is that they might not be seen as good for senior management.
There's a lot of contradictions in there. What is good for the profit of the major shareholders is often not good for the organization in the long run. That's already a huge conflict of interest.
All right, let's dive into this conflict of interest a bit more. If we talk about management and upper management's conflict of interest, could you explain what's going on there? Why would they be troubled by what we would call real agile, real design thinking? Is it loss of power and control that they're concerned about?
That's how I see it. If you actually had more of a systems view of things, you would realize that if you're increasing agility to make smarter bets faster and learn your way forward, why would you want that capped at the low ceiling of product teams? A lot of the most important decisions are made well above the level of product teams. So why wouldn't you want agility and smarter bets made at the planning level or at the finance level? But when you go there, then there is this conflict where the teams are wanting more of the say than they usually get. So there does tend to be a power struggle there.
Is the implication there that while teams are willing to learn, iterate, figure out as you go, that management, the exec, are not interested in learning?
That's often the case. And it's not like management is bad and the teams are right. That's not even what I'm saying. The way I put it in the blog post is that Agile tends to be politically naive. I think that you're trying to get some specific group of people to change their behavior in certain ways that solves problems for them in a way that will also create value for the business. Well, the real medium of that work is design, and the medium of design is decisions. So decisions are made amongst humans, often via conversation, and most of those conversations happen in meetings. And that means it's inherently political work. A lot of it has to do with influence and advocating and organizing. And it would benefit a lot of people to study less product work and more negotiation, community organizing, and influence. That's how things get done.
Can you tell us about the hidden transcript?
Sure. So that is a concept from James C. Scott. He is a sociologist, and he had this concept of the dominant and subordinate transcript. So what that means is that people in a more dominant position will tend to alter their behavior around people with a more subordinate position, and then vice versa. So the public dominant transcript is when the executive is presenting and they want a certain narrative put out there, and they're not going to contradict that unless maybe with each other off stage. And the same with the subordinates, that they will have an offstage consensus of their higher ups, and the hidden transcript is what they'll say to each other, but not to their boss.
So this results in a difference between the claimed culture and values and directions of the organization and the actual culture.
Yeah, so the way I like to say it is that there's a lot of marketing work done around values and culture, but your real culture is the behavior you incentivize. So if what you're messaging doesn't line up with the behaviors, people can detect that.
Yeah, and we certainly see this a lot where people are doing siloed waterfall product development and calling it agile, for example.
I have an issue with that, though. Design was always iterative before Agile even existed. It's just that they tend to mean different things by the term iterations.
I wanted to talk to you about the incentive structures. You had an interesting model of base versus superstructure. Can you run us through that?
Yes. Base and superstructure. All right. So that's a Marxist concept. So he was arguing that a lot of what you have incentivized in your economic base is the fundament of what we often talk about above that we spin off culture, we spin off religion. And you can see that as things evolve and change. I mean, Christianity under feudalism is very different than Christianity under capitalism. it evolves to fit that underlying economic reality. And you can think of that as an example of base and superstructure. You can also apply that to organizations. We can talk about Agile, we can talk about OKRs, we can talk about discovery and experimentation. But if that's not how people are actually incentivized to work, then again, it's incongruent, and people are going to do what they're incentivized to do. What you incentivize is policy, all else is lip service. I heard an example in one of your recent episodes where we talk about the importance of making work visible, but a lot of organizations today incentivize people to do the exact opposite.
Yeah, but what does the base consist of? Is it an economic base, a material base?
Yeah, an economic material base. What is actually your performance review based on? What at the end of the day are you going to be reviewed on? And that's going to shape a lot of the work and how you describe your work and how you approach your work. And that has a ripple effect through organizations. You can talk all day about systems thinking, but if you're incentivized to maximize the results of your particular silo, you're going to do a lot of things that make the overall system worse. And so no matter how eloquently you talk about systems thinking and how important it is, if you don't change that underlying economic reality that people are not incentivized to actually think systemically, it's not going to happen.
All right. So then as a manager, I am trying to maximize my personal economic outcomes within a resource-constrained system. And I have to decide, what am I really being rewarded for? Maybe I'm being told to be agile, to be nice to people, to implement DEI, whatever. But I believe that my managers are really only going to reward me based on hitting my sales targets, for example. And then I and others above me tell stories and provide explanations. But really, what's motivating all of that is my attempts to maximize my material outcomes. So I might say a whole lot of things that are exaggerated, distorted, self-serving, not true, in order to maximize my personal outcome. Is that what we're saying?
I think it goes back to the hidden and the public transcript, that you will have the public transcript where maybe you're talking about the importance of agility and you want teams to embrace systems thinking, whatever it is, but the hidden transcript is always there. If you're an executive, you're going to also be focused on what makes you successful with your own superiors in your position as an executive. A lot of executives are not in their job for all that long, and they need something big that is perceived to be a success that will help them transition to their next position. And so they're not going to be as interested in learning their way forward and having people poke holes in the thing that they have a vested interest in having seen as a success. I've always run up against that as a UX researcher because a lot of requests for research are not genuine requests for research. They don't want you to surface information to drive better decisions. The decisions are already made. The degrees of freedom are already spent. They wanted you to surface the right data to help market what's already been decided. And that's a very different ask. So I teach teams to spot that and to negotiate up front so that they can have maximum impact and to work with where they are in their situation and to get people on board and build a coalition to maximize things so that they can have an impact within their own bubble. If you're in a system where people are doing OKRs and break all of the best known practices about OKRs, as they always do, you might not have the political clout to get the policy at your company changed, but you can start with your team and the organization your team is in and grow a coalition where you are making positive impact.
I'm having general trouble connecting to your experiences because my experiences are really different. So I've worked a lot in government, and maybe I'm just terrible at identifying this, but I could see subtle undercurrents, but often the hidden transcript and the stated transcript, I always thought were actually the same. I haven't done a lot of corporate work, but I certainly have done some where when we get together and figure out what the vision and goals are. It's been done genuinely. And what's uncovered and stated is actually the goal. But this is entirely possible that it's the nature of the organisations that I've worked in. And I haven't worked in corporates. So I might just not have seen what you've seen.
Sure. Well, I think it depends on how much hierarchy is involved in the effort. So if you have a big hierarchy with a lot of tiers and the decisions are cascaded through that hierarchy, there's less wiggle room to even be agile about. You can talk about agile all you want. The degrees of freedom are already spent. It's tactical, non-strategic, low-impact work. And if you want to break that ceiling and move agility upstream, you have to revisit the decision authority in the hierarchy. And what Andy Grove said is that you want decisions made by the lowest level responsibly possible. So if you're working with people who drive both responsibility and authority down, that's great. It'll be more like what you're describing. If they want to drive responsibility down, but hoard the decision authority up top, it's not going to be like that. Or if it's a less hierarchical organization, we hear a lot about flattening organizations, then it might not be like that.
Yeah, I think in a lot of places that I've worked, the organization's flatter than what you're describing. So I haven't seen quite so much that like really pouring it in from the top to the point where you've got no ability to influence.
I wanted to make the point, Donna, that you said, I haven't seen this. That's maybe because you didn't have the lens to see it. You didn't have the conceptual framework to recognize it.
Quite possibly. It's not my strength. So I've worked in consulting a lot. I definitely have worked in organizations where I was like, I don't understand how things work here. So yeah, I probably haven't seen it.
What do you think, Charles, about having the lens to see that you can't see it unless you already are aware of some of these ideas?
So what you're saying is a point that you often hear in the field of judgment and decision making, that you can't think your way out of the box you're in because you have a conceptual frame that you're going to interpret all new information in light of. And so more information will just be interpreted through that same lens, and you'll treat it in a confirmatory way, and you'll discount what you tag as irrelevant. There was a classic paper by a researcher named Bernd Bremer, and he argued that the way the classroom works is not how the real world works. You get a good grade in the classroom by conforming your view to what the teacher says is the gold standard. But in the real world, there is no given gold standard.
I think this comes out when you're confused. You're in an organization and you're doing what you think is the right thing, and you're not getting the response you expect from people, and it's confusing. You just don't understand. Why aren't they doing this obviously right thing? I think that's because you don't understand what's really going on behind the scenes.
It could be that you don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. It could be that what you think is alignment is actually an illusion because you're agreeing at too high of a level, but you are defining things in different ways. It could be an actual conflict of interest. There's a tendency to view any whiff of politics at work through a negative lens, that you are being Machiavellian or manipulative, and to be noble is to not behave in that way. And what that tends to lead to is what I call the Sir Galahad fallacy. And so you think that if you just do really good work, it'll sell itself. If you just make the perfect argument, of course they'll see the logic of it. But they don't. They're approaching it from their own lens. They're emotionally tagging things differently. They're going to discount certain things, and they're not going to interpret it in the same way. So instead of having this negative lens, it is more beneficial to view politics at work just in light of the fact that what you're trying to do is influence decisions. It's humans making these decisions. Most of the work is done by way of conversation. Those conversations happen in meetings. what you're really trying to do is influence people and grow a coalition around the decisions you'd like to have made. That's inherently political in nature. And that doesn't mean you're being Machiavellian or bad. You could be growing a coalition and trying to influence people in a way that will help the people around you, that will make the executive you are under more successful. So there's often this false halo that you're doing something nefarious. That's not true. Whenever you're having these conversations with people and influence is part of it, did you manipulate them? If they knew what you were doing and they would support it, having known everything you did, then no, they're glad. You were savvy. You understood that these are human beings and that you need to focus on networking and influence and your organizational skills, and that really this is how these things get done. And that, to me, is often a shortcoming with Agile teams. And what people will come back to me and say as well, Charles, Agile was always only about software. And I say, then to heck with it. Why do you want to be stuck in such a small box? You should be focused on trying to use the biggest lever you can to create the most value, however you define that outcome. And in a lot of organizations where they do this stuff well, they have a healthy definition of what outcomes are. Mm-hmm. And that creates space for learning, whereas a lot of people are just saying they focus on outcomes, and they're really not. Agile tends to get in trouble because it's already presuming that the solution is to build more software. It might not be. You might not need to build software to support some process. It might be to redesign the process itself. It might be to change the workflow or change some policy so that it's not even needed anymore. There's lots of different things that you can do if you put on different hats and realize I don't have to approach it from a certain way just because I have a certain role. I can network and find the right people, and we can optimize how we approach this thing. And that gets to another concept, is this idea of tailism versus commandism. Commandism is the mandate from above. They're saying, make it so, and you have to go make it so. Whereas tailism is that you're tailing the user or the customer. You're just asking the user or the customer what they want, and then you go and you build it. Is that how you maximize value? A UX expert would say no, because they would know that what users say their preference is now does not actually predict their future behavior.
Does tailism actually exist? Do people actually just go, what do you want? I'll build it?
I think it does exist, and I think a lot of teams are put in that position. Jeff Patton calls it the client-vendor anti-pattern. I call it the fast food approach to work. So a big problem in the Agile Manifesto is that they say customer, they actually meant business stakeholder. So you have business stakeholders often approaching product teams who are probably in IT. Often there's no real research done upstream. It's that they come to the team, they know what they want built, and they want the team to focus on building it as fast as possible. It's like they're pulling up to the drive-through window at a fast food restaurant and placing their order. And instead of focusing on learning your way forward and optimizing outcomes, the team is treated like line cooks in a fast food restaurant. And they're just supposed to churn out the work as fast as they can.
Or a feature factory.
Yeah, that term was coined by John Cutler. Exactly. They're a feature factory. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you're not focusing on outcomes, how do you know that building more faster is creating more value? If it's not moving your outcome needles in the right way, you might be just creating more waste faster.
You talked quite a bit about stories and controlling the narrative, which is something the executives do, and maybe people who are trying to change an organization could do it as well. So could you talk to us about controlling the narrative?
Everybody does that. That's not just something executives do. We think in terms of narratives, and the real function of a narrative is not to tell you what happened. Here, the facts are A, B, and C. It's more to impart to you how you should interpret the meaning of those events. When people say control the narrative, they're talking about imparting to the other person how you want them to derive meaning from this. All news is propaganda. They're not just telling you what happened, they want you to interpret it through a specific lens. If you want to get people to make better decisions, you want to influence them, it's not just about data and numbers, because data and numbers don't mean anything. People have to contextualize and narratize the data in order for it to make sense. And that's always qualitative in nature. It always bothers me how people will act like just because a quantitative study was done and we're talking about numbers, that it is somehow hocus pocus objective. No, even if it was a quantitative study, the way the variables were operationally defined, the way the data were gathered, the way they were analyzed, the statistics, those are all qualitative decisions that are baked into what you're calling an objective quantitative number. And you can go in and change some of those qualitative decisions and get a different result. It's all about the narrative and about influence.
So moving on to the solution, how do you think organizations should be set up and organized? Charles?
I think organizations should focus on defining and maximizing value, both for the user or customer and for themselves. And that's a social relationship, and it should be treated as such. I think that a lot of times we're not even defining value, and that's a big issue. Your definition of value matters more than your definition of done. If you build something and you're calling it done, and it doesn't achieve the outcome you should have been trying to achieve, it doesn't matter that you're done. You'll probably move on to the next thing, but the outcome's still not achieved.
Well, how do you define value then?
That's a big issue. Value is often defined in a circular way. And that's an issue with Agile too, that it's all about getting value to the customer or business stakeholder faster. But what's of value is what they tell you is of value. You're not anchored to something outside of that transaction that you can look at and say, I was optimizing this. So I think that you need to get the right people in the room and start having conversations around value and explore different lenses and realize that different people have different narratives and they're going to have different stakes in this. My number one rule of consulting is that your client doesn't want you to maximize value. They want you to make them be successful. And those are often not the same thing. Those are different lenses. If you have this notion of the users that you will be supporting and you start to get some idea of what the underlying issues are and things that you think will benefit them the most based on your research, that might be different than what the users are asking for, and that might be different than what will make your business stakeholder look successful. So you can optimize that in a way that helps reframe the situation for everyone. It's not the double diamond. You're not starting in problem space and then ending in solution space. It's the idea that for the designer, what you're actually designing is the problem. You're designing how the different stakeholders involved in the decision landscape conceptualize the problem. And you're trying to get them to reconceptualize that in a way that will result in more value than the way they were originally thinking about it. And that's the real goal. You're trying to get people to reframe their thinking. Think of it like a Gestalt illusion. Your problem frame is like the two faces facing each other, and the solution suggested is like the vase between the two faces. If you change those two faces, you change the vase. And it might not be something you were originally thinking about at all. It might be getting the stakeholders involved to talk about something other than what they thought they even needed to talk about. And they realize that the assumed problem is not the problem.
I've certainly been in situations where a client has asked for UX research to solve a problem, which in this case was 50% of the calls to our call center are people asking to reset password because they're having trouble logging in. And we want to reduce the amount of effort and costs to do that. And one of the key sponsors said the solution is this cross-platform password software. And the design team said, okay, let us go off and run that past people and also talk to them about some other options because we think there might be some other ways of doing it, such as the one-time password through text. And the results that came back was the one-time password was far superior, but the reaction was really negative in the presentation of results because the person who was saying, no, we just got to implement this software, were really negative about it. And we were expecting to do a whole lot of work for this organisation to actually implement the recommendation, and it didn't happen. We didn't get the work.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about research often actually, unfortunately, being waste. You need to get upfront agreement that you are surfacing information to have certain decisions revisited. There's something in decision-making called the disjunction effect. And the idea is there's this principle, it's called Savage's sure thing principle. And what it says is that if you're going to do A, given X occurs, and you know you'll do A given not X, then you should not wait for X. But people tend to wait for X. People want X so they can have a narrative to justify the decision, even though the narrative is irrelevant. If they're going to make a certain decision, given you find X, and they're going to make the decision given you find not X, the research is waste. You can surface that up front often.
So what if you are this advocate for change in an organization? What are successful strategies that you can use to get change to happen, given that telling everybody they're wrong is not working?
You having the perfect, most logical argument's not going to change anyone's mind. Telling them they're wrong is not going to change their mind either. You have to shepherd them to changing their thinking in a way that benefits the outcome. And that will often mean going on a journey with them and having them be a part of a coalition that's going to change both how they're thinking about it, but also how you're thinking about it. You can't just get your way on everything and be right about everything. You need to realize that the work is decisions and it's conversations with humans, and you're trying to build a network that's going to optimize the outcome for everyone. So get the right people in the room, start hashing out what different people mean by different things, and define value. Your definition of value matters more than your definition of done. And when you start having these kinds of conversations, cool stuff starts happening. It starts to shift how people think. They start to realize that how they assumed other people were thinking about it is not, in fact, how they were thinking about it. You get the right people in the room and you surface alignment on what you agree value is going to be for that effort. And then if you're doing the North Star framework, that can be your North Star. And then you can have outcomes tied to it and then let teams learn their way forward, contributing to those outcomes that feed to the key indicators. But the important thing is that you're having these conversations up front to change how people think about it. I see people now arguing that this is a waste of time. You shouldn't focus on things like cost of delay because it's impossible to know value up front. So why would you act like you have a crystal ball and you can just get people in a room and say, this is how much value this will create, you're going to be wrong, blah, 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 blah. What these people are ignoring is that the assumptions about value are already baked into the decisions that are made, or no prioritization would have been done in the first place. So instead of letting that remain hidden, it's better to surface that and get it all out in a way that's visible for everyone in the room to see so that they can hash it out and either align on it or improve it.
Yeah. So that's a starting point, and then we learn from it, and that might lead to a renegotiation of our definition of value.
There are different ways to approach that. You mentioned John Cutler. I've been interacting with him for like a decade. I'm a big fan of his North Star stuff. You start with the North Star, and then if you have big outcomes that you want to achieve under that, and you can have metrics tied to each of them, that gives the degrees of freedom for teams to discover how they're going to contribute to those outcomes. So they're not making the mistake of treating their work as a roadmap of output to deliver. And if they have a roadmap of output to deliver, then flip it around. You take your roadmap, elicit what all of the items on your roadmap are contributing to in terms of outcomes, and then take that stuff off and put the outcomes on the roadmap. And then have conversations around the best ways to achieve those outcomes. That might include what was originally on the roadmap, and that's fine, but often it won't.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we better go to summaries, Donna.
Yeah. So, summarizing, we started by talking about the problems in organizations that stop great work from happening, even though we understand the theories behind good agile and good user experience design, et cetera, et cetera. Why can't organizations actually achieve those things? And you started by talking about the difficulties in command and control hierarchies and how there's a lot of conflicts of interest and different ideas. You talked to us about the hidden transcript, where there's a dominant organisation narrative that they talk about, but potentially a subordinate transcript as well, which is what people actually talk to each other about. And if those two things aren't aligned, then an organisation isn't going to be able to get alignment, especially if that dominant narrative isn't the real underlying goals. We also talked a bit about base and superstructure incentives. There's stuff happening at the base level, but what's actually happening can be quite different.
Well, base and superstructure, I think, is about the economic and materialist incentives that drive the political and social behaviour that you see.
Yep, okay. We started to talk a bit about potential solutions and really all about figuring out how to define the actual value to an organisation, to the actual value to customers, users, and really making sure that those things are clear. And once an organisation understands the real value, working with that, defining outcomes, not outputs, and really understanding collectively those values and working towards them. I probably missed some concepts in my summary. There was a lot to take in.
I can leave you with some rules of thumb. That's how I tend to think about it. So there's 5 rules of thumb. So 1, your definition of value matters more than your definition of done. 2, get your customers to tell you how they define success up front. 3, remember that the medium of design is decisions made. And so getting good decisions made requires influence, org savvy, political finesse. So you might need to reframe how you think about being political at work. If politics has a negative aura, then think about it in terms of relationships. It's the same thing. And when I say that there's often a conflict of interest and there's the teams and the executives, that's not to imply that the executives are bad or wrong. There's different people with different lenses. Of course, there's a conflict of interest. Hashing this out and reframing this to the benefit of everyone is what it's all about. So 4, there's always a social decision landscape at play. That means the real design work's inherently political. And so 5, networking is how the real work gets done. So don't belittle meetings. That's where the real work happens.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of comments on this. First of all, the people who rise to the top of organisations understand this well enough to be able to use these tools to be able to persuade other people to do what they want, in particular, to promote them. And if you learn it, you can get promoted. If you don't learn it, you get stuck. There's a sifting process as people go up through the hierarchy where they learn about this stuff so that people at the top are very aware of it. And this is probably by far the most important skill they have, because you get a lot of people quite high up who aren't good at making decisions, but they're great at getting everyone around them to do what they want. The second thing I would add is that there's always a fair bit of uncertainty in everything we do when we're developing products and services. So while I agree that you should try and define value up front, we have to recognize that there's still quite a lot of learning for us to do. So we have to go on a journey where we say, we think this is the value to the customer and the value to the organization, but then we have to do things to test it. Test, measure, learn, plan, do, check, act.
Right. So you just don't want it to remain undefined. Just because you define it up front doesn't mean you won't discover a better definition. You want to actually build, measure, learn instead of most teams just build, measure, build.
Yeah, this has been very good. I think these lenses are quite helpful for the audience. I found them really interesting to look at and think about. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now, how can people learn more about you and your thinking and your approach?
They can look at The Lateral Lens. That's my blog. It's on Substack. I do some coaching. If people want to reach out, I'm open to that. So you can just type my name. It'll go to my website. You'll find me that way.
And you've got a book on design?
Yes, presumptive design. I do. It's similar to a lot of what we said in this conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for coming on, Charles.
Of course. Thank you.
That was No Nonsense Leadership from Murray Robinson and Donna Spencer. If you'd like to explore better ways to develop software products and services, contact Donna on LinkedIn and Murray at evolve.co. That's Evolve with a 0. Thanks for listening.